When your 40th birthday arrives, it's hard to know what to ask for. But when Ferrari turned 40, they knew exactly what they wanted because they built it themselves. And this is that car, the F40. Not just a great birthday present, but a great car as well. And the last Ferrari that was personally signed off by Enzo Ferrari himself. But that's not the only thing that makes this car special. It was almost called the 40, but I think you'll all agree F40 sounds better. A no-nonsense name for a no-nonsense car. There's no power steering, no power-assisted brakes, no carpets. And if you want to listen to any music, then it has to be the sound of this 2.9 litre twin-turboed V8. Based on the engine from the 288 GTO, but with a larger capacity and more boost, the F40's V8 makes 478 horsepower, or so Ferrari claimed. That doesn't sound a lot in a world of Chirons and Regueiras, but then an F40 only weighs around 1,200 kilos. That's possible because it has load-bearing composites within its metal space frame, and it's clad in a bodywork made entirely of Nomex, Kevlar and carbon fibre. Pretty high-tech stuff for 1987. And being so light, the F40 isn't slow. In fact, it was the first production car to claim a top speed of over 200 miles an hour. 201 to be precise. Of course, to get there, you can't just jump in and floor it. There's no traction control to get you off the line, just the grip of those huge 13-inch wide tyres at the back. And you could make yourself lunch while you waited for the turbos to spool up. But turbo lag aside, the F40 is as sharp as they come. That unassisted steering, those unpowered brakes, it's all so pure and crisp. You couldn't be more connected to the car if you were stitched into it. Ferrari originally said they'd build just 400 F40s, but demand was so great they ended up making 1,311 of them. Mind you, that's still not many. You're a lucky person if you get to drive an F40, even luckier to own one. And then if you do own one, there's a good chance you'll end up coming here to DK Engineering, Europe's leading F40 specialist. But that's not all DK Engineering do. They were founded in 1977 by husband and wife team David and Kate Cottingham, hence the DK name. Originally a Jaguar enthusiast, David began to focus on Ferraris in the late 70s and hasn't looked back since. The firm has restored, sold, serviced and stored thousands of the world's most sought-after and valuable sports and racing cars. From the priceless 1948 Le Mans winning Ferrari 166 MM Barchetta to several McLaren F1s and almost everything in between. If it's adorned a bedroom wall at any point, then you can bet it's either in DK's workshop, showroom or storage facility right now. They're also a founder partner of the Carhuna platform. James Cottingham is director of DK, and what he doesn't know about F40s is probably made up by someone on the internet. So first thing, James, the story of the horsepower, this 478, is that what they really were?
So about 20 years ago we got a rolling road at DK and we started rolling testing the cars, and we started to find that a non-cat non-adjust, which is the early specification, would have on average 500 horsepower, maybe up to 510 with a sports exhaust, whereas the cat non-adjust cars, which are later with a catalytic converter, were usually about 470, 480. And that was for two reasons. One, there's more restriction, and two, they actually changed the cam timing to reduce the emissions to meet the regulations of 1990 or 1991. And so actually, a cat non-adjust is slower than a non-cat non-adjust, but to make up for it, second gear ratio is shorter, so the 0 to 60 was still the same. Yeah.
Different ratio.
So the gearbox is actually slightly different with different ratios, only on second gear for a cat car.
What about the weights? I mean, all this carbon fibre. 1200 actually sounds almost a bit heavier. Are they actually weighing at that?
So two things there. We've actually got a restoration F40 at the moment. People see it, they don't know what it is because there's no carbon. It's actually a steel chassis frame. All of this Kevlar here is wrapped around the steel chassis frame to make it stiffer. And it does an amazing job, it does it really well, but it's not as light as carbon was later on. Although, 1,200 kilos is still light. Actually, especially with the earlier cars, we do tend to find they're much closer to 1,000 kilos. So couple that with the earlier cars being quite often 500 brake horsepower, 500 brake horsepower per tonne. That's why, even by today's standards, the performance is pretty astounding.
And have you ever tried the 200-mile-an-hour limits anywhere on a runway or somewhere?
I mean, I've definitely seen the speedo reading 200. Whether it was 200 or not, I'm not sure. As we did just now, when you were cruising along at 10 miles an hour in fourth gear, they are quite usable in a weird way. Even though it's a bit noisy and a bit crashy, it is quite usable.
But we can trickle along here at what, 22,000 revs is that? Which my rev can?
Hopefully 2,200 revs.
Yeah. And it's as docile as anything. Trouble is you can't resist, can you? That's the trouble. When you look down that lovely Ferrari gate and you just want to play with gears and listen to the engine, it's just so lovely just to use that gearbox.
Partly because of the sports exhaust though, so an F40 with a standard exhaust sounds utterly rubbish. It was that point in time where there was no exhaust technology, it was either silenced or not. There were no switches, no valves, nothing like that. So you have to have a sports exhaust. But the other thing that comes from that is everyone that comes to buy an F40 says, I'm going to do loads of miles in it, so I want a higher mileage car. I'm not prepared to pay the premium for a low mileage car.
Doesn't that drop the value a lot, then, if you're high mileage?
It does. I mean, this car's done 69,000 kilometres, so it's been well used, but as a result, it's probably over £1 million less than if it had done 690 kilometres.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. It's £1 million price difference for 68,000 kilometres difference.
But what's the lowest mileage one you've ever seen then?
There are still delivery mileage cars out there. 1, 2,
and that earns you an
300
extra
cars.
£1 million.
Yeah.
Well, what about, we talked about specification, you talked about the difference between the cat and the non-cat. I mean, what's the premium specification?
For me, it's got to be a 1990 or earlier.
Low mileage,
non-cat, non-adjust. And the reason for that, a few things. One, hopefully that chassis was made when Enzo was still alive, so it's truly last of the Enzo Ferrari era.
Yeah.
Two, it's a simpler, purer design. That was the way, Materazzi wanted the F40 to be. No cats, no adjustable suspension, just pure. And I think, we've talked about weight being a bit lighter on the earlier cars, we've talked about power being a bit more on the earlier cars, and actually aesthetically in the engine bay, a non-cat, non-adjust just looks prettier because it hasn't got the extra bar and the heat shield and the cooling vent, all that stuff. So for me, that's what it has.
Listen to that.
Yeah.
We're stationary, and that's still music to my ears.
That's what I was coming back to when people say, I prefer to spend a bit less and have a car with more miles because I'm going to drive it.
What about sort of niggling faults that they have hidden in some cars? Are there any drawbacks?
I think number one, first and foremost, you want to make sure you buy a car that hasn't been damaged during its life. And the way to do that is to buy from a respectable dealer, or at the very least, have a car inspected by a dealer. After that, there are little foibles. These cars are now 35 years old, so we have things like the fuse boards going wrong, but they're repairable. You have to have the fuel tanks changed every 10 years, but it's just a process. And now the values are where they are. Comparatively, it's not massive cost. It's £15,000 for us to do it, and you do it once every 10 years. Tyres are easily available, parts are readily available. It's just, you have to remember it's an old car, so sometimes there's a bit of deterioration that you have to attend to. But year on year, on average, they're not expensive to own and maintain.
How many miles between services then would you recommend?
I don't think anyone would ever do enough miles in a year to warrant 2 services in a year. And I'm not saying the car's impractical, I just think it serves for a purpose, which is, high days and holidays, short blast, thrill, enjoyment, put it away. There are so many other cars out there.
A bit of gear changing, and a bit of flipping, that's all you need.
Yeah, popping and banging.
That's what you need. Then, what about this classic thing? Is that something you must have when buying and selling Ferraris nowadays?
I think with an F40, it's a nice addition, but everything that a Classic A tells you, you can find out without having Classic A. The most important thing is gearbox and engine number, do they match? Obviously, if it isn't certified, it shouldn't put you off buying the car as long as you can confirm those points. And it is something that you should get in due course so that you've got that factory rubber stamp. There's no doubt about it. It's a nice thing to have. but I wouldn't let it put someone off buying a car. More important is condition.
Oh, hold on a minute, James. Hold on, I've got an empty road. Oh, heavenly. And then you lift off and it crackles away.
The overrun's almost better than the acceleration, isn't it? But yeah, it's not about making sure the car is perfect in every respect. I think every F40 you buy, there's going to be a compromise of some description. Yeah. And like this car, the mileage is quite high, but then you're never going to be scared about using it.
Number of owners, is that factoring?
Number of owners, it's nice to have low owners, but you've also got to remember these cars went from being 150,000 new to £1 million, and then within 2 years to being £100,000 again. So a lot of them languished in the 90s, where people have paid $1 million for them and just thought, I'm going to park that problem and forget about it. So generally, 90s service history is really thin for an F40.
And Providence, I mean, Nigel Mansell owned one. Do we know any famous owners?
I think
that raised the price of the car?
There are a lot of famous owner F40s. It's a really nice thing to have. I think some people will pay a premium, but personally, I'd be paying more for, a car that ticks other boxes like weave, which we haven't talked about, but non-cat, non-adjust, condition, and actually the way it drives. The cars are quite different car to car, and it comes down to who serviced them, who set them up.
Then what about improving the F40, updating it? Is that a big no-no because you're changing the car?
Personally, I think, an F40 LM spec rear central wing, which is a removable item, fit it. I'm okay with that. I think brakes are the big weak point of an F40, and in the past, the only option was to go for bigger discs and calipers, but that meant bigger wheels. And so they didn't look like F40 wheels anymore. You had these upgraded OZ or Enkai wheels. But what we've developed in the last few years is a ceramic disc and pad conversion that sits in the standard wheel and goes in the standard caliper. So it's fully reversible. It's about a £25,000 upgrade, but what it means is that you've got brakes that consistently work. So not only on the first application.
Worried now. I thought the brakes are fine on this car.
That's because it's had the upgrade. But not only on your first stop are you probably looking at a 20% reduction in distance from 100 miles an hour to 0, but over the next 10 stops, it's a consistency. Whereas on the standard brakes, the stopping distance from 100 miles an hour to 0 on the second, third, and fourth will increase as the brakes get hotter and can't cool. Because that was the biggest problem. The design of the wheels can't get the air out, whereas the ceramic brakes work at a different temperature range. So we solved that problem completely, and it has transformed the cars. And most importantly, because they don't squeal. So normally standard brakes on an F40, you come to brake, and as you get to below 15 miles an hour, everyone's looking at you thinking, who's that arsehole in that big red Ferrari? Whereas now it's just the crack and popple.
So where is the price range now then, from the longest mileage, rough-looking F40?
Your highest mileage, rough F40, without accident history, is going to be a minimum £1.65 million.
Oh, really?
Your most expensive F40 today quite possibly could be a £3 million car.
That's big, because I remember I filmed one on Fifth Gear about 6 or 7 years ago, and they were about £1 million then. And that was quite a good one. That Classic K and all that stuff. He got it for $1 million then. So they've gone up a lot.
Yeah, and I think all of these cars, when they have their journey, over their 35 years as an F40 now, you get to a point where there are jumps. So you never really find a period where they were 1.25. They suddenly went from $1 million to 1.5, and then suddenly they were 2 million, and then suddenly they're 3 million. It's a really weird thing that happens. But when you've got cars like this that are this valuable, and the market's changed in recent years, you might find a guy that's been looking for a car for 3 years, taking his eye off the ball for 6 months, and doesn't realise that there's been a price jump. So that's why the whole auction environment's so interesting, because you get everyone in a room with a deadline. They like what they see. They know, especially with Carhuna, that they're buying from someone trustworthy and reliable. They can ask all the questions. They can have the inspection. They can have the inspection in the meantime, and they know that at the end of the day, they're bidding against everyone else who's also willing to buy the car, and you're buying it for a fraction more than the other person was willing to pay, which is an ideal scenario.
Well, I think this is lovely, but I can't afford whichever price range it's in. But this is I'd like to drive. Seats are amazingly comfortable. I was worried the seat would be a bit harsh.
Well, I think these seats are either small or medium, so they're perfect for a racing driver.
So, how many F40s have passed through DK's loving hands?
Well, it is hard to keep track, obviously, over the years. But we did a really thorough tally up of sales about 10 years ago, and we were over 200 back then. And you know, easily today we're
200.
But we're now at like 350.
Or different F40s.
Not necessarily different. Some cars will have cycled through us 2, 3, 4 times, but again, not that many. So you know, in terms of the number of F40s on our books, we have 300 F40s, but we haven't necessarily ended up buying all of those cars or, you know, servicing all of them. But certainly through our hands, you know, it's been over 350 now, and it just keeps going.
That's a quarter of the entire production.
It's good, isn't it? It is good. And hey, look, it's been a real stable car for us. It's been interesting over the years that when I started selling these cars, or when I was first involved in the industry, not necessarily selling them, but watching sales happening, you'd see a guy come in with his nearly new 355, add 25, 30,000 pounds and drive out with an F40. Whereas today, someone that's got a 355 probably won't have an F40, you know, because it's a different bracket of car.
Yeah,
But everyone that we sell F40s to today tends to have, you know, 10 cars minimum.
So I mean, when it comes to restoring F40s, are they a relatively easy car to restore by modern terms?
There's one thing that you can't do, and it's something we've not really touched on, is weave. The early cars, especially, the thinner the paint, you know, the lighter the car was, and you'd have this texture to it, which is carbon Kevlar weave. And it's a misconception that every car should have weave.
Yeah.
It won't. It varies car to car, but it's often more prominent on an earlier car, and it's a really nice thing to see. But when you restore a car and you're painting it, you're restoring it to concours condition. So you don't just flash over. It's impossible to get that finish. And funnily enough, a lot of people in the early days complained about the quality of finish, because they said, I don't want to see this weavy look.
They don't want to see it.
I want pristine finish. So many F40s were refinished at the factory.
Overpainted.
Yeah, or painted again at the supplying dealer, or painted in the early part of their life. So, you know, it is amazing. But it's one of those cars as well that the more it's used, the more it suffers. The carbon Kevlar changes colour on the inside panels.
Yeah.
All the water and the dirt and the muck gets in the engine bay, and it bakes on because of the heat. So these cars are getting to a point where now they're 35 years old that they do need a restoration. And I always say to people when they're surprised by that a 275 GTB of the mid-60s, by the time it's 35 years old, it's probably approaching its second restoration.
Yeah.
These cars haven't been touched, they've just been maintained.
And not only is this gearbox a joy to change gear in, the steering without power steering, it's so positive, it's beautiful, it's not heavy at all, points and goes.
And we're spoiled today because everything's assisted. And like some, you know, it blows my mind that a lot of cars we drive don't even have a steering column. You know, that really freaks me out.
There have been other limited production Ferraris. There have been other Ferraris that are spectacular to drive, but none of them have been this. A lightweight go-kart with a fizzing fuse of an engine, personally signed off by Enzo Ferrari himself, which is why the F40 may well be the greatest Ferrari of all time.